that we're going to have our vendor talk about, but primarily this meeting is to have DRC share their evidence of validity. That is a theme that we hope to continue with the March meeting. This is March, May meeting with ACT and Cambium, who will present evidence on ALPA 21. So we will continue these conversations around evidence of validity for our assessments and the vendors who provide them. Folks who are on the call who are not our TAC members, if you would be so kind as to place your name and your role in the chat, that would be very helpful. And there is a Google Doc that is collecting that for us. Okay. I am going to share very quickly our agenda for today. As I said, we have that conversation around standard setting. That's what's going to be first on our agenda. And then DRC will take us through their evidence up until 1 o'clock or however long it takes. And I do have the date for the next TAC meeting for May 12th. That is on the agenda. So I'm going to turn it over to Chad. If you have any opening remarks that you'd like to have as president. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks, Trudy. No, just to welcome everybody. Appreciate the opportunity for everybody to be able to join us again today. And I think maybe mostly for Jeff and I, the Celtics had a big win last night. So I wanted to get that on as we move towards the playoff season. And also maybe a little shout out to my hometown of Pierce, who their boys qualified for the state basketball tournament again. So we used to just be a football school, and now apparently they play basketball there too. Yeah. So in terms of our agenda today, we'll start with just any comments on the minutes, and then as Trudy said, we're going to give NWEA and their contractor an opportunity to present a plan for standard setting this summer. And then we'll have DRC, we'll kind of shift from general assessment topic into alternate assessment then for the rest of our meeting agenda today. And I think just as an overview for those of you joining us for the last couple meetings in this one, part of the reason that we're spending time asking the vendor partners with NDE to walk through the validity evidence they have for each of the assessment parts of the assessment system in Nebraska is in part, this is all evidence that is requested by U.S. Department of Ed as part of peer review. So it's important to, I think from a communication standpoint for partners, stakeholders within the state to kind of know what this evidence is and why it's important for the department to have this going forward, but also because these components of the assessment system also feed into the accountability system. And so during a future meeting, we're going to be kind of shifting from the assessment, some of the assessment questions, which will bring those in kind of on a as requested basis from the department. But we also know that accountability is part of what the department has to communicate to U.S. Department of Ed. And so knowing what these different assessment pieces are will, I think, give us a better sense then to be able to provide input and advice to the department related to the AQuest accountability system as well. And so let me open it up to TAC members for any initial comments, thoughts, reactions about the meeting in general or the agenda topics for today.
Jeff?
Yeah, so Trudy and Chad and I went back and forth about the minutes, and I was a little confused about what we're trying to do in terms of standard setting for the test this spring and then for the tests in 224. So I thought, just a little overview of, what the standard setting will entail and the reasons for it, and sort of the strategy in terms of doing an exploratory study versus a standards validation versus a full standard setting. So just to kind of make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what we're talking about in terms of standard setting, I think would be really helpful. And also, just because at the last meeting, we talked about what does the program itself look like, this through course idea, and what's going to be implemented this year and next year. And, just to kind of, again, level set everyone with where the program is in terms of how the through course will be implemented in the next year or two. I think both of those things would be helpful just as background as we proceed forward.
Okay, the easier question for me is to discuss what through year is going to be. Our NSCAS growth model, which includes a growth metric as well as the scale score, that assessment will be optional for fall and winter. And then the summative piece or the accountability piece will be in the spring. It's still going to be the same assessment. So there'll still be the two metrics, but it will be the spring scale score proficiency that will be counted towards accountability.
And that'll be for both this year and next year?
Correct.
And for the foreseeable future after that, or is this still a discussion point about just, how this will work?
It's primarily a discussion point only because this summer, the expectation is a new request for proposals will go out in June. And so depending on the results of that search, that request for proposal, that will drive going forward what our assessment design and assessment system will be.
So you're developing a RFP,
Yes.
I don't know what you call it there in Nebraska currently for the program?
Yes, sir.
So wouldn't that RFP spell out the vision for the program?
Yes, it will.
Yeah.
But there needs to be conversations with the commissioner and other stakeholders to get their input into what is the desire going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you, Trudy.
Sure. And then as far as the standard setting for math, I did request NWEA to put together a full gamut. So hopefully that's what we're going to be looking at this morning is ways in which to really approach the standard setting all the way up to a full standard setting, primarily because of the concerns that were logged and discussed at the January 27th meeting. Wanted to make sure that we had those plans in place if we did decide that a full standard setting or a truly in-depth look at the cut scores for the legacy standards, what direction that we needed to take. So that's part of what we are listening to this morning.
So, but 2023, I'm just trying to recall the last meeting, there was concern about the standards for the alternate assessment in mathematics. The
cut scores.
The field's feedback was there. They seem to be too rigorous. And I think that's what we heard. And the question was, do they need to be, is there any other evidence that would make one believe that those standards need to be examined in some way?
Right.
Okay. And I think what you talked about was to have a panel or have some body look at whether the performance level descriptors actually line up with the cut scores. you know, in each of those levels, you know, according to the cut scores, is it reasonable to expect that the student should be able to demonstrate what's expected at each performance level, basically? Or was there some inconsistency there? Is that is that a correct understanding?
During the January 27th meeting, when the more focused conversation around the general assessment and the process that was used for the general assessment, not the alternate assessment, because it was very clear that the alternate assessment, the way in which that process was handled, was more in line with what we heard and read about the ELA process. Really what came out in the discussion and the evidence was that there was inconsistencies in the protocol in terms of, did everyone have practice opportunities? There weren't. That after the standard setting had been completed, then there was a policy review, and that policy determined that the cut scores were not aligned with the ELA in terms of rigor. And also there was a conversation around college and career ready, especially in light of ACT. So
you're talking about you're talking about the general math assessment, yes, not the alternate, right?
Yes, okay. Yes. Mm-hmm. So there won't be, we did not plan after the January 12th meeting, we did not plan to have an alternate standard setting on the alternate assessment. Okay. This follow-up information is only about the general assessment.
Okay. So what's the status there of the general assessment for 23? Is there going to be, what's the plan?
Yes, the plan is to have a standard setting process. There will be a discussion, and I know the vendor is going to talk about all of the different pieces of what that's going to entail. But because of the level of concern and the evidence that we brought to the TAC on January 27th, what I took away from that was that we were going to have a full standard setting process with the general assessment and the standards.
Okay, for mathematics, okay.
Yes, for mathematics only.
Okay, right. So that's for 2023.
Yes.
For the spring test, for the general assessment, you're going to basically conduct another standard setting event.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And then for the summer of 2024, now that we have new math standards that we're going to be assessing in 2024, we were going to look at, does this need to be a full standard setting? At some point, we're going to share with the TAC a review of what the new cut scores are that are coming out of this, but then also legacy standards in comparison to the new standards, how far or how deeply do they change? What is the significance of the change? So we will bring those back to you as well, just to get your input into, are these changes significant enough to warrant another standard setting, or is there more likely a validation or some other process?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's really helpful.
Yeah. So today is only about the process that we intend to use or see for the 2023 standard setting for math. Mm-hmm. On the legacy standards.
So just in terms of, is NWEA going to examine the new standards and do some analysis to determine
yes,
the discrepancy between the new standards and the legacy standards?
Yes, I do intend to have them look at that. Yes.
Okay.
In a more
yeah.
To actually submit a report of some kind where there is a crosswalk or some kind of demonstration of the significance. Yes.
Yeah. Good. it might be interesting to just hear from them about, just what the procedure is going to be, what is that analysis going to look like and entail?
Okay.
Because, some of us had had some experience with, shifting standards and having to do this kind of analysis, and might be, it's up to you if you'd like our input on that.
Sure.
Mhm.
That will be discussed with NWEA certainly, and we'll most likely come back to you folks because you're my experts now, and
Yeah.
I need to utilize you folks as much as I can. So thank
Yeah.
you.
Good. And I think, I emailed, I don't want to go on and on, but I did have experience with this with NAEP, because I served on the validity studies panel for NAEP. This is back at maybe 15 years ago, when they were switching they made adjustments to the English standards, and they wondered whether we really need to reset our performance levels, our cut scores. And I worked with a few people on that panel, and we wrote a paper about, when there's a change in the standards, when do you really need to do the standard setting again?
Right.
How do you determine that? So you might want to take a look at that paper and share it with NWEA if you'd like.
Yeah, I will.
It might help them, because we work with some national experts on that, and you might find it useful.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff. I will.
I was going to say, Jeff, if you're able to, or Trudy or somebody from NDE staff, paste that, because Jeff, you sent that link to us.
Yeah.
If you could put that link into the chat for people on the call here, they'd be able to access it too.
Okay.
Because it is, as Jeff mentioned, it's actually a very good kind of systematic review of the characteristics of whether to, like, under what conditions would one want to reset cuts versus carrying forward existing cuts given scale characteristics and things.
Okay. Thank you.
Trudy, I have a question following up on Jeff's about the standard setting process.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know when that would occur in the summer? I guess I'm kind of hoping, being in this school, that, the sooner we can do it in the summer, the sooner those results can be calculated and shared out with school districts. It's all about timeliness of data for school districts.
Yeah.
So hopefully we're looking at doing that at the beginning of summer.
Right now, it's actually scheduled for July 27th. So I'll check with NWEA and ACS Ventures to see if that's going to happen. But yeah, 25th through the 27th. We'll look at the calendar, but I'm unsure that we can change it at this point because we're already collecting names.
Okay, so what's the reason for doing it so late in the summer, I guess?
It all has to do with calendar and folks' availability. But again, we'll revisit that and see what we can do.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Josh, did you have a statement?
I was going to ask similar to Linda, but I think one of my other questions too is, then after that is done, will TAC then kind of look at those results, or how does that typically work just for somebody that's new?
I don't know that TAC has generally done that, but I do plan another review of them actually the next day that these are finished. And so TAC would be invited to that conversation, and hopefully they'll have an opportunity to attend and to weigh in. Okay, barring any other questions, Chad?
Just a quick question.
Christy, yes, I'm sorry.
Clarification. So when you originally talked about the 23 and 24 assessment for gas growth, and you said the spring or the fall and the winter were optional, is the testing optional, or is the growth score going to be optional?
The testing is optional.
Okay, just wanted to be sure I was clear.
Yeah.
And then the RFP, as you're spelling out your vision with the state chief, you had mentioned some other stakeholders too. Just curious who else you are going to be talking to in the process.
There was a request to have public input, but the folks that I specifically would ask for their input is the Assessment and Accountability Advisory Committee. And then also the Nebraska Association for Curriculum and Instruction and Assessment folks. Those two groups in particular, I would seek to have a focus group or some subcommittee kind of thing where they could have specific input into what they feel that the assessment should be designed, that design. Okay.
Any other comments related to the minutes from the previous meeting or any corrections that we need to make sure that those are accurate? Okay. Hearing none, then let's go ahead and move on to our next topic. And so this is going to be NWEA and
Chad?
Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
Do you actually need official approval of that, or is it just corrections that need? I'm just I'm just asking if we actually need a motion, all those things to do for minutes or not.
I don't know. Trudy, do you know, or do we do approval of minutes?
We've not in the past.
Okay.
But Chad, as the chairman, you can, as has been the practice, they just stand affirmed or stand approved.
Okay, that's fine. I was just asking just because I'm used to approving minutes. And
I know. I am too.
No, Josh, I am too. And so my Robert's Rules of Order,
Yes.
PD is kind of kicking in.
Yep.
Yeah, I
Let's
think
go for it. Who's going to make the motion?
Yeah,
to approve?
let's go ahead and start the practice now. March 2nd sounds like a good day.
I'll go ahead and make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
Second.
Okay, I have a first and a second. Discussion on the motion. Hearing none, we'll call the question. All those in favor of approval of the minutes as presented or as modified with any corrections, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstain?
I'll
Okay,
abstain.
we have one abstention, and so the motion carries. Thank you. Excellent. Okay, well, let's go ahead and move on then. One of the things I want to make sure to disclose is one of the things TAC members will sometimes get called on to be engaged in research studies or different activities with the department when it's appropriate and when it's kind of independent of test development activities. And so I just want to disclose that my company does work with a number of different organizations, NWEA, Pearson, Cognia, and others in different capacities, usually in the educational space, doing things like alignment or standard setting or evaluation work. And so the person who will be presenting with NWA here in a moment is actually a colleague of mine. So again, just wanted to disclose that. And so we'll rely on my TAC colleagues to ask questions. And I have some questions as well around the presentation, but wanted to get that out there just so folks are aware. Okay. Ricky, are you kicking things off for NWEA or Karen or who?
Yeah, hi Chad, appreciate it. Yeah,
Sure.
so actually I'm going to hand it right off to Susan from ACS. She's presented a slide deck that will take the TAC committee through a plan so far and some questions that we have to make sure that we're doing approaching it the right way, in a way that makes sense for Nebraska. Susan?
Thanks, Ricky, and thank you all for having me. I'm Susan Davis Becker. I am a psychometrician and one of the partners at ACS. And we are very excited with the timing of this, where we started making plans for this summer standard setting. We have the opportunity to talk to the TAC here and get your input and ideas. We don't have all the details ironed out, but we thought this was a great opportunity to get any general ideas or suggestions, as well as anything specific around the concerns that have been raised about math and how we handle that in the summer activities. So thank you for, again, giving us the time here to go through this. Let me share. I believe a copy of these slides might have been shared with you, but I'll pop them up here on the screen. And this is really a kind of a general guide for us to walk through this. So again, preliminary plans and questions for the TAC. We are looking at doing standard setting for a full standard setting as it was described for English language arts and mathematics in grades 3 through 8, and then a standards validation for science in grades 5 and 8. The reason for the standards validation in science is last year we did the standard setting in the summer and it went well, but we did, there was a lot that was so new with the science assessment. Even in the rooms we saw that some of our panelists had differing levels of experience with adoption of the standards and their experience with the assessment. And so they said, well, they were pretty comfortable with what they did, but they said, we'd like to come back. And so Trudy and I talked at that time about how it might be a great opportunity to do a standards validation now that the assessment is more mature and the state has had more experience with it. Okay. And I guess my full disclosure is I do live here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So I have 2 kids in this system who are taking these assessments.
Great.
Mm-hmm. I get to hear all about it as a parent, so that's really fun. The good and the bad. Okay. All right, so for ELA and mathematics, generally we've described the same process to keep things really simple at this outset, but we understand there's different concerns related to mathematics. And one of our kind of general theme questions is how much do we want to deviate in mathematics to address any specific concerns, or say, hey, we want to apply any of these ideas to both subjects so that, if concerns are raised later about ELA, we can say we did the same thing and here's all the safeguards we put in. So our preliminary standard setting plan is to use a bookmark approach. ACS, our company, will collaborate with the folks from NWEA to create an ordered item booklet that represents the full score range and the content distribution matching those test specifications. I heard the question come up about the timing. NWEA can speak more specifically to their processes, but they'll be taking all of the data from the spring 2023 assessments and working on crunching that and calculating the item statistics so we can present the panelists in the room with a representation of how students did on the test and really representing the full state and all the students who tested. So for those who, yes.
Can we ask questions as you go through this?
Sure.
So when you to create the ordered item booklet, what's the criterion you use for ordering the items in it?
You mean kind of the RP67 criterion? Is that kind of what
Are
you're thinking of?
Are you using a p-value or using a IRT statistic? What do you in the RP value? How are you doing that?
Sure, great question. I will invite NWEA to jump in here, but I believe Young might not be on the call at this time. If not, I can speak more to this.
Yeah, we'll see. He is on the call, but I know that he was on a train heading up to another TAC presentation that he's participating in today as well. I did see, Chris is on the call. I don't know, Chris, if you can speak to what we did last summer. Otherwise, we'll have to get back to the TAC unless you can speak to it, Susan, and what you would propose.
Hi, I'm Chris Metter from NWA. I believe last summer we used the IRT difficulty parameters to sequence the items in the OIBs.
Okay.
With the bulletinously scored items that have step parameters for the partial credit model used for each step.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So in general, we were planning to follow that same process as well for creating these ordered item booklets. And again, the idea of an ordered item booklet, for those of you who haven't had the chance to be a part of an activity like this or review materials, is we essentially create a test form that covers all the different content areas, just like a test form would that a student would take. but it also covers the full like difficulty range. So we start by reviewing this booklet and we see the easiest items first. They get progressively more challenging till we get to the most challenging. And easy versus challenging, that again reflects how well students did. So the first items that we see in this booklet are those that most students answered correctly in this spring in their assessments. And that goes all the way to those items that the fewest students answered correctly. And the task we ask of our panelists or subject matter experts from across the state is to review this ordered item booklet in a way and think about how far a student at a particular level will progress. We're assuming they're going to get the easy items right, and then at some point they will start to reach a level of challenge that's beyond their knowledge and skills. So we're essentially trying to emulate how far they will go, how far their knowledge and skills will take them through that item set. So setting up that item set is very important. We want to make sure we, again, are really reflecting how students performed on the assessments, and we want to reflect all the different test content and the standards that are measured in a given assessment. So we'll work closely with NWEA after the assessments are delivered and scored to get these set up and ready for that July meeting. For ELA, if you're familiar with the assessment, there are passages and items, specific items that go towards those passages. They'll be using a passage book so they can stay mindful of what passage that students are referencing as they answer each item. Because we know that within a given passage, students might see easier items or more challenging items, just depending on what knowledge and skills are being measured. So in terms of a process, what we're thinking about is a 3-day process for each of these subject areas. We'll work with NWEA and Nebraska Department of Ed to recruit and select panels that represent the different school districts, the different regions across the state, different types of classrooms, different levels of experience. And we'll put together panels that represent grades 3 and 4 will be one panel, grades 5 and 6 will be the next panel, and grades 7 and 8 will be the third panel. So each panel will be tasked with looking and recommending standards for 2 grade levels. We like to start these kinds of processes with a big training activity. We want to make sure everyone hears the instructions the same way and gets to start off on the same foot. We will have the state involved and be making some general presentations to the panel. And then our team will take over presenting the training on the process and how we want them to consider these expectations for students. We'll then divide into those grade level panels and start working with the achievement level descriptors that Nebraska has developed and really reviewing those, because those are going to help us start to think about conceptually what students should know and be able to do at each level. Once we have that same conceptual framework solidified, we will engage in a practice activity so everyone's comfortable working with something like an ordered item booklet. And then we'll do what we call operational standard setting activities. And this is an iterative process where you get to go through that booklet or that ordered test form, make your judgments. You get to submit those. You get to hear how your judgment relates to that of your colleagues. We'll give feedback information. We can have a discussion, and then we'll have the opportunity to revise those judgments. It's always nice to be able to have a preliminary recommendation than a final recommendation, so you feel really comfortable about it. After each panel goes through that for one of the grade levels, they'll repeat the process for the second grade level that's within their grade span. And then we also have a plan to engage in vertical articulation. One of the things we want to think about is that this is a system and students are progressing through the system. We want to make sure there is a general coherence across the grade levels in terms of our expectations, and then in turn the impact or percent of students in each achievement level. Vertical articulation is an opportunity to review our preliminary recommendations across all of these grades. It doesn't mean that we have to have the exact same percent of kids on track or developing at each grade. It means we want to put all of these results together and ensure that they make sense, that we didn't have one panel set extraordinarily high expectations compared to another. We want to, again, kind of get our ideas down about How do students progress across the grade levels? What might we expect to see in differing levels of impact? And do we see that based on the standard setting recommendations? So that vertical articulation review is important so that we feel comfortable with this full set of cut scores we're presenting to the TAC and the State Board of Education. And then we did talk about preliminarily a potential policy review of the mathematics cut scores with the AAAC as a possibility before it goes for final approval. So that's just one of the options we have out there.
AAAC, what's that?
Trudy, help me out here. Assessment
Sure,
and
it's Assessment and Accountability Advisory Committee.
Okay,
And it would be a subcommittee from the larger group. There are close to 50 people on the AAAC, so there'll be a subcommittee from that group reviewing these.
And standard setting itself is an interesting process. Once you've participated in some way or seen it in action, it makes more sense about how these subject matter experts, these panelists, are making these types of judgments, what they're considering, how thoughtfully they're considering the achievement level descriptors and what the characteristics that they see in their classrooms or the students that they work with. But if you haven't been a part of it, it does seem like a little strange. Like, how did we come up with these numbers, these recommendations? So one of the options we have suggested is that if the state would like anyone to observe the process, just again, sit in on some of these discussions and activities and see how this all works so that they can feel more informed to evaluate the results, we welcome that.
Hey, Susan.
Yes.
Before you move on, that last bullet point there of policy review of mathematics with the AAAC, is there a reason why you wouldn't bring the ELA and the science? Also, you mentioned that it's a system of assessments, and so wouldn't you want to bring all the subjects?
I believe so, yes. We started with this, as I mentioned earlier, we started with this particularly here because we were thinking about how we could help with the specific concerns around mathematics, but I do think it makes sense if this group would feel comfortable to have them review the all subject areas so they could consider it again as part of the full system.
so Susan, I don't know if you're going to go more deeply into any of this, but just a couple of comments on what you presented. One, often in the standard setting events that I've taken part in, the panelists actually take the test as part of the training. You might want to consider that. It gives one a real, it's like a reality check on these items and how difficult or easy they are. It gives the panelists a good sense. The other point is around the rounds of judgments that occur. I see there are just 2 rounds here. And so that on round one, they're going to get, after round one, they get feedback. So what's the nature of that feedback? Is it just how other panelists, so maybe you're going to go into that, and I don't want to, maybe you're going to talk about that, but if not, maybe you can talk about it now.
Absolutely. Great question. So the nature of the feedback, the first bit of feedback we like to give folks are making sure they recognize what cut scores they set. Typically, they have an idea of what their expectations are, but we can talk about how that translates to a student score. We then kind of help them understand how that relates to what their colleagues did. If there's maybe 12 panelists in the room, they might say, how did I relate to my colleagues? So they'll get to see, was I on the high end of the group, the low end of the group, right in the middle? How do my expectations relate to them? We then also like to show the impact being what % of students from the spring 2023 assessment would be within each of the 3 achievement levels based on what the group has said as their preliminary cut. We've got some ideas of some potential other feedback, which is what's coming up, but that's where we start as a feedback. And then sometimes what we would do for like a bookmark, we might have a discussion and say, we see a range of recommendations. Let's open up our booklet, which would probably be digital, but let's open up our digital booklet and talk through how we made some judgments around this area where we said this is probably where a student at a given achievement level would be able to progress with their knowledge and skills, but might run into challenge and not be able to answer the subsequent items correctly. So we have some discussion around that so they could hear how their colleagues are thinking, not forcing everyone into consensus, but just to give them that opportunity to think through a different perspective. So that's a start of the feedback. Other feedback we had talked about was if there's additional external pieces of information that should be shared. I do believe the previous conversation was, there was a previous conversation around potentially using NAEP results, state NAEP results. The most recent state NAEP, I believe, was 2022. So we'd have that available for 4th and 8th grade. NWEA has also offered how they mapped, Young may not be able to jump in here, but he mapped the different state test cut scores for the proficient or on track level to a common scale, the states that use the NWEA assessment system. So there could be an opportunity to see how does Nebraska's cut score or their preliminary recommended cut score align with what other states are expecting for a given subject and a given grade. Or we're open to other ideas here of what might be important feedback for these panelists to consider.
So that's all good impact data. The question is, do you give them all of that after the first round? Or do you have a first round where they just kind of, you give them the other rater feedback, what you initially talked about, allow them to readjust, if they want to change any of their judgments, they can do that. Then look at what the new result looks like and perhaps provide the impact data at that point. People do standard setting, they're the purists. We just use the ALDs or PLDs, whatever you want to call them. And we'll just do the judgment, make our judgments based on what those PLDs are requiring students know and can do to be in any particular performance level. I think providing some of this impact data is useful because the question is, when you provide it in, is it going to require a big shift? And if it's going to require a big shift, then it brings the PLDs into question, where maybe the PLDs weren't rigorous enough. But long and short of it is, you might want to consider, rather than providing all of this information after the first round, maybe have it provided after the second round and let them make another set of judgments after the second round. Just so, otherwise it could be information overload for them after the first round. That's it.
So Susan, maybe as a question to other TAC members and maybe the State Department as well. Like, I know you say here, like NAEP results or using RIT values of proficient comparison across states. Is there something that TAC members would say, yeah, that these are good external sources or benchmarks that should be provided? And are any of these things from the state's perspective, from a policy perspective, that you think the panelists should have as additional information?
I guess I would really agree with the NWA because we have a large number of students in Nebraska, obviously taking NWA and having those. I think NAEP is also a good, I don't know beyond that, if there's really much of anything else that would make sense for us, but I think the two that's listed here makes the most sense to me.
Yeah.
Could MAP be used since most of the state gave the MAP assessment?
I think MAP is how the RIT score is derived or something, isn't it? Isn't that?
Yeah, is that correct, Susan? Is that where the RITs are coming from MAP?
I'm going to ask, I see Young came off mute. I would ask him if he can share about that. If not, my understanding was that it was the state's proficiency cuts on their summative assessments, but I could be wrong about that. So Young, fill us in here.
Thank you, Susan. Sorry, guys, I'm on the train if you hear some background noise. So essentially, we did some linking study, linking their proficiency cut to their rate scale. So actually, we can provide that ranking, like for all the, I think we have 37 states with those cuts. We can rank order them for each, both EO and the math for each grade, and provide that ranking as per what Susan said earlier. Does that make sense?
So are you saying you could use MAP? Because I was thinking that the RIT can come from MAP or from the INSCUS growth.
It's gonna be MAP. It's gonna be the MAP growth. Yeah, because we did that link their state, the summative assessment to that risk scale based on the MAP growth at the beginning.
So the comparison would tell us how the panel's expectations for proficiency or on track in Nebraska would compare to the expectations other states have set via the MAP growth.
Yeah, right. So think about like Nebraska. So for example, like math grade 8, if the cut is like, I just made a number like 2100, we found its corresponding score on that rate scale maybe 220, right? So we found that for that, Nebraska math grade 8. We do that for the other states. We have that linking reports on, then we rank order them. So you'll get a sense of like how rigorous or how high we're setting the cut in Nebraska for that particular assessment. So methodology wise, we use equal percentile linking, like the same group of kids, they took MAP growth and the summative. At that time, we use equal percentile linking to find that corresponding scores.
So I think I understand what we're doing with the RIT scores and comparisons to other states. I guess I'd be a little bit hesitant to compare that much to other states when you're trying to set Nebraska specific expectations and how different those might look from state to state. So I would definitely rely on PLDs, obviously, as your first measure, and then look at NAEP information just to get a benchmark for Nebraska of where does NAEP look. But I don't know how aggressive I would be in pursuing information from other states, because that's just going to level set you against other states that might not be high performing states or might be extraordinarily high performing states, and doesn't provide the context for what Nebraska needs to set as proficiency expectations. I also worry a little too, given NAEP is a rigorous expectation, a lot of state assessments maybe aren't as rigorous as NAEP are, that there's going to be conflicting information coming into play. And so I'd be careful of how much information we provide, especially on other state expectations. I mean, I think maybe the final smoothing or overall policy decision maybe can take some of that into context, but probably not on the standard setting piece with the committees.
Yeah, I agree with Christy totally. And I think in terms of the public, they don't really see other results of other states. They do hear about NAEP. And if you, for example, identify 80% of your kids proficient, and NAEP is identifying 30% of your kids proficient, your governor has a big problem. Just public perception among policymakers will be that our assessment is not a rigorous assessment. You don't have to match NAEP, but I think because NAEP is more public, and you're going to get compared to NAEP, and you may not get compared to other states, but NAEP is kind of considered more of a gold standard, if you will. It is rigorous, but I think a lot of states have moved towards setting their cut score proficiency to be kind of consistent with NAEP. Most states are a little bit lower. Some states are right on it. There are a few states that are even higher. But I think NAEP is a good external benchmark to kind of evaluate your cut scores.
I would agree that I'd be careful about comparing to other states as well, because it's our assessment.
Yeah.
So am I hearing this suggestion that maybe would NAEP, for example, be best used as part of like a policy review versus trying to integrate it within the panel discussions?
No, I would put it into maybe after the second round, or I would make it part of the impact data that you provide the panelists. There's two types of impact data that sounds like you'll provide. One is, if you set your cut scores here, here's the percentage of students that are going to be at each level. Okay, and then you could say, and this is how it looks like in comparison to NAEP. So that's the impact. So they have, how they set their cut scores, what the impact will be, and then be able to see whether that impact seems to be kind of consistent with another external benchmark that's widely accepted.
I agree with that. And I also agree with it being after round 2. I think after round 1 is too soon to introduce impact data from external sources. It should be more of a discussion of what is everyone else thinking.
Right. Another question do you have another question?
There's lots of ways to do this. Standard setting is there's so many ways to do it. Some states have started with sort of a range of cut score range, if you will. It's almost like a standard validation saying we hope we can be consistent with NAEP at least in some way. And they might say, if that's the case, here's about where those bookmarks should be placed. Now, I'm not suggesting you do that, but it is an approach some states have taken. It's a combination of looking at your PLDs and actually having sort of a predetermined cut score to a certain degree, where you have a lot of flexibility. You don't have to exactly adopt it, but it kind of speeds up the process, if nothing else. I like what you're doing so far. So sounds good.
Another question we had related to this process is about the vertical articulation. Most often this is done at the end of the process. I described those 3 panels, grades 3 and 4, grades 5 and 6, grades 7 and 8, and how they're going to be working through their tests. They're going to be in each room. We'll have panelists or experts who have experience working with the standards at those grades and in those subject areas, working with students who are in those grades. But then at the end, we want them to come together and see how the entire picture, grades 3 through 8, looks. And the best way to compare that is with that impact data. So what % of students based on 2023 would be developing on track and advanced? And again, we want to see a coherent picture. It doesn't mean the exact same numbers across the board. It means that we understand any fluctuations based on how students typically progress. Sometimes what we've observed in practice is by the time we get through that, we get the panels through their 2 tests and we bring everyone together, they're pretty happy with the work they did. They're pretty ingrained, right? So if we see some disconnects, we start to have a little trouble getting folks to come to an idea of how to change things. So one question we have was, should we integrate this idea of a vertical review earlier in the process, maybe after each panel finishes their first grade level assessment? Let's say we start with I'm going to pick on the higher grades, 4, 6, and 8. And I picked on those grades because we have NAEP at 2 of those. But let's say we do each panel works with their higher grades first. Should we bring them together to say, let's look at 4, 6, and 8 and see how the numbers are working out and see if we need to have a discussion around this before we go into grades 3, 5, and 7? I guess I'm talking about is there an importance on the vertical piece and reviewing across grades that we should emphasize more than letting each panel go too deep into their own grade level work first.
It's a novel idea. I've never heard it being done before. So I don't have any experience with that.
I don't either. And I think the risk for me is sometimes participating in these standard settings, you do have one voice that's very loud or respected in a group, and that could influence across the entire spectrum. So I don't know if you want to introduce that right away after round one, because that might influence the entire grades rather than, you know, having separate grade spans where if one of them's out of line, you're like, okay, let's think about why is that one out of line and composition of committees and stuff. So I understand what you're saying, and it does present some challenges in just about every standard that we participated in, but that's why ultimately at the end the department usually has to smooth some things out based on just policy decisions. So I'm mixed on that, but I do know it could end up influencing everything across the board for the better or worse.
Susan, if you're planning to use the state level NAEP results in there, from what I'm hearing from the committee, if you start with grades 4, 6, and 8, as you suggested, would the introduction of kind of those external benchmarks kind of serve as kind of a pre-articulation, just because we know that if the committees are going to anchor against something, that if they're using NAEP, they would do it in 4 and 8. And so in a way, aren't you kind of doing that by introducing the external benchmarks?
Potentially. I think one of the question around that goes back to the earlier discussion of what Jeff was bringing up, which is, well, how similar do we want to be with NAEP? Do we want to look at NAEP and say, we want to make sure these aren't so different that in the press, in the public, this would seem, raise so many questions? Or are we going to say, well, we just need to be comfortable with the relationship between what the state is going to be reporting and what NAEP reported a year ago? We want to think about, like, unless we have a plan to match NAEP, I'm not sure if we necessarily have that built in yet.
I kind of like that idea, though. As long as people realize this is a benchmark that they're not required to meet exactly, that it's, and the thing is that what's supposedly driving where they're going to set their cut scores are your performance level descriptors. So if they're told that, NAEP is identifying about 45% of the students in your state at each grade level, the various grade levels, as proficient. And then they sit down and they do their standard setting and they come up with 60%. It could be they did their job really well, and it's the PLDs that aren't as rigorous as NAEP's PLDs. So this is, they hopefully are not, and maybe when you wrote your PLDs, there was review of the PLDs against NAEP's PLDs. So it all starts, this is all about the standards. All standard setting is some sort of a, how do we articulate our standards in terms of a test score, right? That's the process. And if your standards aren't as rigorous as NAEP, you're not going to set your cuts as high, and vice versa. But if you feel that your PLDs are somewhat in alignment with the NAEP achievement level descriptions, then, talking about NAEP at the beginning of the process maybe isn't a bad idea. In terms of we're going to present with you sort of a benchmark at the beginning here, understanding it's not required to be met exactly. If you're way above it or way below it, we have to come back and talk about why.
And Rhonda noted in the chat that proficiency levels of NAEP are different than Nebraska's proficiency levels. And so what types of comparisons would you be doing, or would you have the panelists doing if those benchmarks are introduced as part of the process?
you know. Does,
I
does-
think- yeah.
are there how many standards are there in Nebraska? I'm not even sure. Do you have? Four
Three
levels?
achievement levels.
There are 3. So NAEP has 4, so that already brings in a little issue, but okay.
Yeah, that's what I was just looking because I was the coordinator for a little bit, but they do below NAEP basic, and then there's NAEP proficient and NAEP advanced. So I was that would just be something we'd have to really make sure we're thinking through.
Yeah, you could work with that.
And again, I think it's that, as was suggested, Jeff, you mentioned reviewing the descriptors for both NAEP and the state to see where do we see the strongest connection, and then presenting it in the right way to say, it's not saying that Nebraska standards are lower. Many states are like this, but here's where we see this connection, and here's how we want you to consider this. Again, maybe it's not a matching, maybe it's making sure that we have similar results when we line up particular levels, or nothing stands out as unusual that would draw attention or suggest a problem with one of these cut scores.
Right. You could just start with the very generic definition of proficient in Nebraska, and what's the generic definition of proficient on NAEP. So for example, NAEP says proficient is a strong command of the subject matter. Okay, it's pretty and able to solve problems. Let's say that's the generic definition of proficient on NAEP. Well, what is the generic? What's the generic definition for proficient in Nebraska? Does it talk about being a strong command? Does it talk about being able to solve problems? And if it has that kind of language, then you're someone in the ballpark. That might be, because I think at the standard setting, you don't want to get bogged down in going into a lot of the details of, the very grade level specific content, performance level descriptors. But I would take a look to make sure the general definitions of the performance levels are somewhat consistent.
And I want to expand just a little bit on something, Christy, that I think you said, and that was, or at least my interpretation was, if you start to do any sort of articulation, review, or consideration after they do the first assessment, the panelists could start to almost pre-smooth in their minds, and that then potentially introduces like another factor that you don't want them to think about when they're applying the PLDs to the second assessment, because as the content people, you want them to kind of focus on anchoring the content of the PLDs to the assessment and the cut scores, as opposed to thinking about, well, here's what we set for or recommended for 4, 6, and 8. How do I adjust for 3, 5, and 7 to kind of fit within that framework? Is that, Christy, that's what you're kind of getting to, right?
Yes, I don't know if you can see me nodding, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Susan, is just also just as a time check here, we are at the just beyond the top of the hour. Do you think we'll be wrapped on this within the next 10 minutes or so?
I think so. If there's not any other ideas for ELA and math, we've taken a bunch of notes and we'll go back and keep working on our plan here. I can jump to science. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think
okay.
Some nods.
Sure. Great. Okay. I mean, I don't get all 3 hours of your time. No. Okay. So science is a little bit different in terms of, first is a standards validation. And one of the things we learned last year in working with the science assessment is that there's a lot involved in it. So you can envision an assessment where students see a question or task, and then there's a number of information sources they might have available to review. Maybe it's 1, maybe it's 2, maybe it's 3. And as students progress through on the questions on a particular topic, those resources might change. So, the first one might go away, a new one may come in. And so one of the things we learned very quickly in looking through that assessment is that it's important to show that assessment in the order that students experience it. And because those test forms are very specifically designed, not just in terms of what content is in there, but the order in which it's shown. And we saw the standard setting panelists having a lot of great discussions about students and their experience navigating the test in that way. So we're using a different approach here, a different methodology, but it more closely follows the standard setting methodology that was used last summer. So what our plan is to review the 2023 test form at each grade level and kind of provide the panelists a map of how an equated cut score would play out in terms of more Engolf style judgments. And by Engolf style judgments, we're saying which items or questions would we expect a student who is on track to answer correctly versus which questions would we expect the student who is advanced to answer correctly. So as the panel goes through the test, works their way through, looks at the resources and the questions and thinks about how students would demonstrate their knowledge and skills, they can follow along with this map and say,
I don't know how to
here's
shut the volume off, so I'm going to try and work here.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I
just wanted to give.
Okay, sorry, just getting some feedback there. Thanks. They're going to be able to think about how does the standard, where does that standard expectations come in, again, based on the equated cut score that was set for the 2022 form. Again, sometimes in a standards validation, we might ask panelists to make a holistic judgment or to review one number. And we believe for this type of test and the design and there's a lot to it. There's a lot of information to consider. We really wanted them to be able to walk through it task by task, item by item, and think about the standard, make their notes and comments, and be able to have a discussion around that. So that's our plan, is for each of our panels to be able to walk through the test, think about the equated expectations, take their notes on where do they agree, where do they disagree, and have it and engage in discussion around that. And then the subsequent discussion would be about potentially, is there a need to raise or lower the equated cut scores? If so, what would the impact be, and what would be our content justification for that? But, again, using the ALDs that were developed and what they're seeing in the test form. So I'll stop there, see if there are particular questions about the design. Yeah.
So are you going to provide them with the yes, no's, and they're going to confirm them or dispute them?
Correct.
Rather than just go through it on their own, try to do that. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, we do. Again, the standard setting last year, we feel went well and has it turned out well, but with so many things being new, we had a lot of discussions around districts across the state being at different levels of adoption of the standards, of the three-dimensional standards, different levels of experience with the test. I think even our panelists learned a lot about the test, even though their students had taken it. They were like, oh, I didn't realize that students should be prepared to. And some of this was just information maybe they hadn't absorbed before the test administration. So we recognize that even another year of experience would really might change things in terms of our expectations. And so we thought it would be a valuable time for this for panelists to review and provide input on where those cut scores were set.
And so, Susan, this approach is essentially saying that if this were an ordered item booklet, you're putting the cuts in kind of at the point. So if it's 15 out of 25, the cut would be at 15. But because of the way that the assessment is organized around tasks, you're basically kind of breaking this up. So it's not like a sequential ordered item booklet. It's where the items fall kind of clustered by task. So I would look at your example on screen and say, I would expect on task A, the on-track student to get 2 out of those 4 points. I don't know if these are polytomous or dichotomous.
Dichotomous.
Dichotomous, okay. So I would expect the student who is kind of just on track or barely on track would get 2 out of 4 points on task A, and the barely advanced student would get 3 out of 4 points on task A. Is that how one would
Correct.
interpret that?
Correct. And the idea, the reason why, instead of just giving them those numbers 2 out of 4, 3 out of 4, why we say which ones, is that kind of brings in that item difficulty information that we might often see like in the ordered item booklet. It tells folks, hey, we expect them to get 2 out of 4. And specifically, we're thinking they're going to get items 1 and 3 because those were the easiest out of this set. And they can think that kind of helps them understand that. We had again, a lot of great conversations last summer about just the complexity of some of these items. We think providing them this level of information will be helpful. Rhonda asked the question in the chat about, would the same panelists be asked to come back or new panelists? We had a lot of fun with the panelists last summer, but we would recommend new panelists simply because we don't want folks to come back. We don't want to bring them back and say, now you have to review your work and tell us if you were wrong. We want new perspectives to come in and say, this is where it was set in 2022 based on the information that we had, and now we want to look at it again to update it. So same recruiting strategies in terms of bringing in experts from across the state, but we would like to see some new voices involved.
So my only question here, since you're giving them the yeses and the nos, so they're going to have to make a really strong case to want to change one of those. And I'm just wondering if the bar is so high that they're going to be reluctant to question anything. Maybe not, because after all, we set the standards, and this is what the people thought last year. Who are we to question them now? So I think just trying to see, I like the method here. Just say using this yes/no method, the saying off yes/no method is a good method. I'm just, again, not having experienced this. You might want to investigate in some way whether this is just going to compel them to agree.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think a couple things that we might see is, again, one, there might be a compelling empirical reason, just based on the data. Again, the student difficulty and for the item difficulty information will be available. The impact data will be available. They'll be able to see that. Again, they can review what's, like, for example, item number 2 here, where the on-track student, we're not expecting them to get it correctly. We could look at the ALDs and what's required for that item and say, maybe we should be requiring it. We're expecting this based on a content perspective. So we'll have that type of discussion.
Out of just curiosity, have you compared proficiency levels on the science assessment with NAEP's proficiency?
I'm going to look to Nebraska for that question. I do not believe, we've not done it, but I'm not sure if they have.
Sorry, what was the question?
Have you looked at this assessment compared to NAEP?
No, we have not.
Because let's just say that NAEP is identifying 40% of your students as proficient in science. And based on this standard setting, the results showed 75% of your students proficient. That would provide some motivation for people to go, well, maybe we need to take a closer look at some of these questions where we said students on track wouldn't necessarily need to be able to do this. So again, you might consider bringing in that external benchmark as part of the process to review what's going on here. It might be the reverse for all I know. Maybe the standards you set are very rigorous compared to NAEP. So again, it just might help people make an argument for one way or the other about some things.
It also provides that consistency if we are bringing it into math and ELA. Why not science as well?
Yeah, right.
Jeff, can you maybe just talk a little bit about, I know you've talked a lot about that, of what states that you've worked with and they see it one way or the other with NAEP. Are they are they changing then that to be more in line? Are they just using it as an indicator to say, man, we're close to it, so we're good? Or how does that typically work with other states you've worked with?
Well, typically states will try to, typically states are below NAEP in terms of, or have been, over the past decade, or even further back, below NAEP in terms of their proficiency standard. So when they've set new standards, they have used NAEP to ensure they're moving closer to NAEP. And they probably have, at the same time, need to look at their achievement level descriptors, because it all starts there. So I would say for the more often than not, states are trying to move towards the NAEP standard than move up to it rather than come down to it. I hope that, I don't know if that answers your question, Josh, but is that?
Yeah, it helps. I just think I just want to be careful as you have all these teachers here coming to work, and then I think it's a good thing to bring in to discuss. I'm just curious on your experiences. Are they then going back and redoing everything because they're one way or the other too far off or too close? But I think it is a good indicator just to see where they're at.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, if my guess is if you're really far off, you need to look at and you want to be close, and you want to be closer to NAEP, you need to look at your performance level descriptors. Because so my guess is if the standard setting, if your standards are relatively, rigorous, and your definition for proficiency in Nebraska is somewhat like NAEP's definition for proficient, you can end up with standards that are consistent. If I'm just saying, you might want to look at that before you get into this, because if you're already kind of consistent, good. If you're way off, then you have to think about whether this particular approach, if you're way off and you don't want to be so far off, you have to think about whether this is the right approach to validation. I'm kind of talking out loud here about, but it might be a good way to kind of use NAEP to evaluate, your starting point here. Are you way high, you way low, are you about right? And then use that information to say, well, given where we are, how does this approach, is this approach consistent or going to get us to where we want to be?
Susan, I had one more question, and I want to give everybody on the TAC an opportunity if there are any more, and I know we have to move on in our agenda. Given that you're planning to present this to panelists kind of by task, is there something that you're planning on in process for the panelists to be able to kind of consider the kind of the, I don't know, the whole or the compensatory nature of the score, so that they're not caught up in, well, they didn't pass task A. So it's almost like this cumulative effect of a what appears to potentially be a conjunctive decision could end up with cut scores higher because they're looking at it kind of task by task as opposed to across all the tasks.
Sure. Yeah, one of the things we've thought about is maybe starting actually at that high level to kind of have that conversation about here's where we are based on the initial cut scores that were set on the first year of this assessment, and talking about how we had a lot of faith in that process, but noting that everything was brand new. And so we like to continue to monitor it and kind of painting that picture so that when they go through and do this review, it's not just, well, I have to stay the same, or I have to like critically evaluate everything. They can have a little bit of a lens with which they want to review it. And again, to the point that Jeff made earlier, is think about, if there is a reason for a change, we're going to want an argument for it, but we don't want them to be scared to bring up that argument. So we want them to feel like they understand how any suggested change might impact that total holistic test score requirement or the impact.
Okay. Any other comments or reactions to the standards validation plan for science that Susan's sharing?
Chad, I don't have one for science, but I do just have an overarching. I know this is a technical advisory committee, but I have seen some good intros to standard setting and some not so good intros to standard setting. And I do hope in this intro that the conversation is about student success and what a successful student is able to know and do and what's meaningful for the student, rather than just focusing on where's the impact data, what's the cut score, but really making sure that we're looking at, if this individual student can do these things, will they be successful in the next grade or once they leave high school? So just making sure that when we start the process, we keep the student in mind first and foremost before we dive into all the technical. And then as we're coming back and showing impact data, also again focused back on the students. Because I know we get really lost in numbers and cut scores and all these different values that we're trying to set, but we sometimes lose the perspective on, should we do it a little bit higher or a little bit lower? And it's like, what is going to mean more to the student for later life outcomes?
It's a great point. Okay. With that, thanks, Susan. Thanks, Ricky and the NWEA team. And all right, I think we'll let you sign off and move on to our next set of presenters. And Trudy, who from DRC is going to kind of lead the conversation?
I believe Lee McKenna is here from DRC, as is Betsy Rogers. I don't know if those two in particular are going to be the folks who lead. So
Betsy Rogers here at DRC. I'll just take a minute to introduce myself a little bit, and then I'll share the slide deck that we have here. I work kind of across alternate assessments at DRC. I work specifically with our special education content experts, who then in turn work hand in hand with our subject area experts. And so for the alternate assessment, we have that kind of balance of special education expertise working together with our content experts. And so I work kind of across the alternate assessments, specifically in content development with our special ed team. So I'm just going to share the slide deck here. Maybe thumbs up if you can see my screen. All right. So I know we kind of spent the morning talking about the general education assessment. And so just very briefly, I want to give just a quick overview of what the assessment looks like for the alternate assessment and talk a little bit about the student population and their learning characteristics before we kind of dive into, I'll talk about the content validity, the cognitive process validity, and then hand it over to psychometrics to talk about the internal structure validity. And so I kind of just want to shift our attention to these specific students. And as we're working through the documentation that we have to support our validity argument, I guess our question is, are there additional things that we should be documenting or incorporating into our process? So we know that the alternate assessment is for the 1% of the student population that has severe cognitive disabilities. And I always say the learning characteristics of that 1% that participates in the alternate assessment tends to be more diverse in terms of their learning characteristics than the 99% that takes the general education assessment. And this is a one-on-one administration, and the students have the flexibility to respond with their primary mode of communication. And then the test pages and the response methods, there's some flexibility and adaptation to meet those individual modes of communication or the needs of specific students. It is an online administration, so those students who are capable of using the like a touchpad or a mouse, they can respond directly to the items themselves. If a student isn't able to select their response in the testing engine, the proctors then captures the student response and enters it into the online system. And then print on demand. So for those students who are able to engage in the online testing engine, there is on demand paper testing. And so it's unique in that this is just an example of what the proctor sees. And so you can see that there are it's a very specific script. This is pulled as it's an online tutorial so that they're familiar with the functionality of the online system. So the operational items don't have that little practice hint, but you can see that there's the indicator. So the extended indicator is at the top, and the domain and the DOK level. And then there's in the say section, that script. And so the proctor is expected to follow that script verbatim. And then in the italics, the items have kind of proctor directions. And so the proctor is expected to do or say something specific. So they might point to a specific picture or say something specific, but anything in bold text is read verbatim. And then what the student actually sees is just a portion of that. So they see the needed text and then the answer options. And so sometimes that might be a graphic, or the answer options might be a graphic, but it's a lot less than what the proctor actually sees and needs to administer the assessment. And so I do want to just spend a little bit of time talking about the learning characteristics. And I do this because from a content development perspective, we have to consider that full range of student abilities as we're developing content. And so it's not necessarily any one of these learning characteristics that determines eligibility for alternate assessment. And I'll kind of talk about the state's eligibility process here in a second. But it's important to understand just how diverse their learning characteristics are. So you might have students with different IDEA disability categories. So you might have students who with in a category of a mild or a moderate or profound intellectual disability. There might be students who have a disability category of autism, but we know that within those disability categories, it doesn't, a disability category doesn't tell us a lot about their kind of their academic functioning and their access and communication needs. So we know that there's a wide range of kind of expressive and communication skills. So you may have students who are able to communicate and receive information at a symbolic level. So they're able to use text or verbal language and words, or they may be kind of expressing their needs in a way that might be more gesturing or pointing or eye gazing. So they're able to indicate their needs or a choice, but it may not be at the symbolic level yet. And you also may have students taking the assessment who their response may not always be consistently clear. And so our development process, we want to make sure that we're providing a wide range of opportunity for students to kind of show what they know and can do in relation to the extended indicators. So we know that there's also a wide range of academic abilities. So there may be some students who are reading for meaning and able to do computations, and there may be some students who need a significant amount of support to engage with their academic material. So those learning characteristics are certainly considerations that our team keep in mind as we're developing the content. But again, it's not any individual learning characteristic that determines eligibility. And so this is the state's participation criteria. And so it is an IEP team decision. And they kind of think through the bullets that are listed here. So the student would have a extensive, pervasive need for support in order to kind of show progress towards the academic standards. There cognitive functioning is significantly below age expectations, and their kind of ability to transfer that across environments is impacted. The student has their curriculum and instruction is aligned to the extended indicators, which are aligned to the Nebraska College and Career Ready academic standards. And that they need significant support to engage with and make progress towards the academics. They aren't able to make progress towards the general education standards, even with significant adaptations and accommodations. So in addition to those kind of considerations for the IEP team, they may also have some of those other learning characteristics that I kind of just outlined. And so that being said, there is some demographic information that's collected. And so I have demographic information for each grade here in the slide deck that was provided, but I'll kind of just walk through one if you're interested in taking a deep dive into that. It's there in the slide deck that was provided. So each grade has a student count. Demographic information is collected on gender, race, and ethnicity, food program, English language proficiency, and the accommodations that are used by subject area. So that is kind of the demographics and accommodation summary that's collected. I believe it's provided by district, but NDE will have to keep me honest there. So that is just some of the demographic information that's collected. If you're interested in looking at a specific grade, it's there in the slide deck, but I'll kind of skip through each grade.
So the total count there is approximately 1% of the enrollment at that grade level?
It should be, yeah. And so it looks like based off of this demographic information, it ranges from a little over 200 to around 250 students per grade. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty small group of students. So I'll move.
I was just going to say, Jeff, just so you know that the state requires that you do your best to get under 1%. And if you have anybody over 1% as a district, you have to provide rationale for approval of why.
Right, right.
So I'll move into just talking a little bit about what sort of documentation we have that supports the validity of the assessment. And certainly we're open to suggestions if there are additional things that we should be doing or documenting or incorporating. A lot of the evidence is documented in our tech report. And so the tech report describes the technical aspects of the alternate assessment. And then each chapter contributes important evidence that kind of pertain to test development, scoring, item analysis, ROSH calibration, scaling, and reliability. But then in chapter 9 of the tech report, it actually kind of summarizes and synthesizes the evidence based on the framework presented in the standards. And so I'll talk a little bit about content validity and what our development process is and what sort of documentation that we have there. A lot of the evidence is derived directly from our item development and test construction process. And so through that process, we make sure that every item aligns directly to one of the extended indicators. And those extended indicators are directly aligned to the Nebraska general education standards. And so they're reduced in depth and breadth and complexity. And so after the items are developed, it's an iterative process. And so those items go through multiple rounds of content and bias reviews. And then after field testing, items are reviewed with respect to the statistical properties. And then there's a decision we're able to use them on the operational assessment. But they are reviewed for content and the psychometric properties. And of course, NDE has an opportunity to review at multiple touch points throughout the process. So this is kind of the content development cycle. And you can see the little black icon indicates at each point that the Nebraska educators and the Department of Education assessment staff and curriculum staff have an opportunity to be involved in the development process. So again, we started with the general education standards, and educators were involved in the kind of reviewing and finalizing the extended indicators. And then they were involved in developing the performance level descriptors and the test design and blueprint. And all of those three things, the indicators, the performance level descriptors, and the test design and blueprint are used to create development plans. And then Nebraska educators actually write the items after an item writing training by DRC. And then they're peer reviewed at the item writing workshop. And then they're reviewed internally for content alignment and bias and sensitivity issues. NDE has an opportunity to review those items, and then we move them into field test slots. Then we review the performance data and build operational forms. And so we have kind of a number of documents that kind of show this process and document the things that we look for.
Betsy, is there a new form every year, or have you developed one form and it's used year after year?
So I will lean to psychometrics to talk about this, to keep me honest, but there is a new form every year, and 60 to 80% of the assessment is created from an overlap of items from the previous administration. And then there is 20 to 40% that we refresh from the operational item bank. But there is a new form built every year, and there are 2 forms.
Yeah, I'm just, and are field test questions embedded in the operational form?
They appear at the end of the form.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm just asking this because it is a test that's administered by the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And, unlike the general test where teachers supposedly don't see the items, and there's not a way to actually teach the items before they're administered. I'm not particularly worried about that here, but the fact that there's some new items in the test that weren't previously administered by that teacher is a good thing, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great. So we use the WEB's DOK levels and stages model for alternate assessments to make sure that the items align with the extended indicators. And we kind of look at it from both a cognitive complexity and content complexity. We established test design documents and blueprint specifications. We made sure the items were sufficient in number and made sure that we were meeting the content distribution that are outlined in the blueprints. And NDE had Nebraska educators involved in writing items. And again, that training was provided by DRC to support that the development of high quality items. And then each newly developed item was peer reviewed. So a Nebraska educator peer reviewed the items that another educator had initially authored. And so there's kind of a peer review process built into that meeting. And then we take the items back, and the content specialists and editors at DRC provide additional reviews. And so, as I mentioned before, DRC has a team of special education content specialists that work very closely with our content specialists in order to really maintain accessibility for the student population, but also maintain that content fidelity. And it also goes through a bias review for any bias and sensitivity issues. And of course, it goes through our editorial team as well. And so these are the DOK levels and stages. And the level really, you can see the need for a DOK level 1 is more simple recall, but you can see with the stages, the content complexity can kind of be varied a little bit. So we have two DOK level 1s, which is kind of direct recall, identifying, but then we can vary the content complexity a little bit. So in stage 2, the item may be a direct match of a detail. And then in stage 3, there's some understanding of the text, but it's usually explicitly stated in the item. And then DOK level 2 is requiring a little more cognitive complexity. So there's some interpretation and some analysis. And then the item requires deeper understanding of the content. Sometimes there might be inference or a requirement to kind of sequence information in order or interpret information. And so we think about the cognitive complexity as well as kind of the complexity. And so these brief descriptions kind of outline what an item in each of those stage may look like. And this is actually included in, there's a training on DOK in the item writer training, which was provided in the materials there. And so then we have the table of specifications, and this is really used, one, for item writing in terms of the extended indicator, but also in test construction. And so you can see the extended indicator is in red. And so it's reduced in depth, breadth, and complexity from the general education standard. And then you can see it outlines the number of items in each DOK level and stage. And the idea is that we have a variety of cognitive complexity as well as content complexity at a given extended indicator, so that we're giving that full range of student learning characteristics an opportunity to show what they can do in relation to the standard. So we have these, the table of specifications, and then we have, of course, the ALDs, and there are 3 achievement levels. All of the extended indicators, the knowledge, skills, and abilities from the extended indicators are represented in the ALDs. And so we have developing, on track, and advanced. And DRC drafted these, but then they were refined and finalized with a committee of Nebraska educators. And then we have documented a test construct, like a forms construction guidelines document that outlines the test design by content area. And so it'll tell you the number of items and points across the domains and DOK levels both. So we're making sure that we're meeting that content distribution as well as a wide range of the DOK levels. And so this document just kind of outlines the form construction process. And so it outlines what we do with Nebraska educators or with NDE in conjunction with NDE. It is also another opportunity to, check the item data and the, making sure that it, from a content perspective, that it meets all of those things that we need to see in a high quality item. So this is an additional check for content in terms of alignment and the quality of the item in conjunction with the data. And so we have this forms construction guidelines document, and we do have kind of those content guidelines and DOK guidelines by content area. As I mentioned, it's unique in the items are written by Nebraska educators, and so we compile. There is a group of general education as well as special education educators. Again, DRC provides that training, and then the items are peer reviewed, and then we do kind of some internal checks to make sure that you know, just in terms of quality, clarity, making sure that the item is aligned to the extended indicator, that it's grade and age appropriate, that we have the appropriate difficulty level, as well as the depth of knowledge stage, and that we're really making sure that we're only assessing what's intended by the extended indicator. There's one correct answer, that we have plausible distractors, and the graphics are accessible and free of any extraneous visual elements while still supporting the text, that there's an appropriate language demand, and then of course we put it through a bias and sensitivity review. So after kind of going through that whole process, there are several statistical analyses that are conducted in the field test data. And I'll let psychometrics kind of speak to this a little bit later as they talk about the internal structure validity. But the items are once again carefully reviewed by DRC staff, NDE, and content staff with respect to their statistical characteristics. And then, of course, the alternate assessment is administered using very specific standardized procedures with allowable accommodations. And so the administration procedures training was also provided in the TAC materials. And so then I'll talk a little bit about cognitive process validity. We did just receive our third-party alignment study for science, which documents the linkage between the extended indicators and the assessment items. And it also documents the range of cognitive complexity across the content. And so that is something that we just received and we're reviewing internally to make sure that there aren't any gaps that we would need to address in our new item development plan. And then of course the extended indicators themselves. Again, we use the Webb's DOK, and it really makes sure that we're measuring the kind of what we intended to measure, but also that we have that full range of cognitive complexity. And again, we did provide the proctor training materials, and those trainings provide very specific instructions and protocols for the proctors to make sure that everything is administered with fidelity and in a standardized way. And then we also provided the item writer training materials. And so you can see that we make sure that all of the newly written items are really tapping into the intended cognitive process. And that training PowerPoint was also included. So you can see kind of how the Nebraska educators are trained before writing and reviewing the items. So that's what I have for the content validity and cognitive process validity. I will hand it over to psychometrics to talk about internal structure validity.
Can I just ask one question on the cognitive process validity? Mm-hmm. Have you ever done any what they call cognitive labs to actually observe how students are engaging with some of the problems to see if, you know, they work, that students seem to understand them? Look at the process the students are going through and whether it seems reasonable, just as one form of, you know, evaluating the cognitive validity of the assessment.
I don't think that we've done any COG labs, but I would you know, defer to my colleagues and NDE to keep me honest there. Are there, I guess, my question about the cognitive labs would be, do you have any recommendations for any kind of adaptations to that process given the learning characteristics of the student population?
This is Sharon from NDE, and Jeff, no, we have not done any COG labs to do that. We have had discussions about it, but we have not done that at this point.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's not, I don't think it's required, but maybe something as you move along with the program, maybe with particular item types or, new things that you're introducing into the test that you're, want to try out a little bit. It's part of a field test, if you will, especially as you're introducing with technology, any kind of new kind of ways of measuring students' understanding of certain concepts. Might be something to put on your agenda at some point.
Thanks, Jeff. I will have a conversation with DRC about that.
Good.
Right, if there aren't any questions or more thoughts about the content validity, I'll hand it over to psychometrics.
Betsy, sorry, before you move on to the internal structure, just one question around the content validity piece, and that is in terms of how the blueprint is developed for ELA, well, for all of the subject areas, what sort of process occurs to kind of define what's included and what isn't in terms of that connection from the general content standards to the extensions?
Yeah, I would defer to Sharon to weigh in on how those meetings have gone, but I would expect that it would be a process of having some special educator input to make sure that they also reflect their instructional priorities. But Sharon, maybe you can speak a little more about how the blueprints were developed.
I sure can. So Chad, what we do is we bring in, well, we've been doing it virtually lately, but we bring in special education educators along with, depending on the availability, we also would have 1 or 2 general educators who review everything and give us input as to what they feel maybe need to be adjusted. And we go back and we review them with DRC and NDE, and then we take them back to the educators to review them again. And then we put them out to the districts on the website in draft form, asking all districts to look at them and provide any input, again, before we actually take them out of a draft form to make them in the final form. And then when we're doing item writing, all of the educators that are here for item writing are given an opportunity to look through them to make sure that they feel that it's at a level where items can be written to effectively assess those standards. Does that help?
Yeah, it's given how choices are made for the alternate assessments, sometimes I think from peer review documentation evidence, part of it is just important to kind of explain the rationale as to why certain areas of the content are prioritized over others.
Oh, that makes sense. Totally makes sense. When we are looking at these extensions, we do realize that some of the general standards are not at a level where we can actually make extensions for those. But when we create our documents, we make sure we put all of the standards in there with a little statement to special education educators to realize that there may not be an extension, but it is still their responsibility to be exposing their students to the other standards also.
Okay. Any other questions on content or cognitive process before we move on? Okay, so Betsy, thank you so much. And why don't you go ahead and hand off to psychometrics for this next section, and then and Trudy, where are we with respect to timing right now?
We are coming up on when we had planned for a break. So actually, I think maybe just a 10-minute break, stretch break, come back real quick. Should be a good place right now.
Okay, that's probably a good idea. Why don't we go ahead and break, and then when we come back, we'll dive into the psychometric piece. So let's, sorry, Trudy, what did you say, 10 minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Awesome, okay. Let's come back then at 5 after 11 Central Time. All right, we'll see everybody in just a moment. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We ready to proceed, Chad?
Yeah, I would say let's go ahead and jump back in. Welcome back, everybody. And yeah, Linda, yeah, as Trudy mentioned, please feel free to eat your lunch. And I've been like scarfing down a few pretzels here offline too. So please, anybody feel free to do that as we listen to the next section of the presentation from our colleagues at DRC. I'll turn it back over to, and I don't know who's presenting.
Mayuko, do you want to take yourself on, put yourself on camera and introduce yourself quickly?
Yes. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
You're really soft, Mayuko.
Okay. Increase the volume. Oh. Maximum. Can you hear me better, or still too small?
That's a little better, yeah.
A little better, but not great.
That's actually pretty good now, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me know if you cannot hear me. Sometimes I have problem with Zoom. Yeah. Some people's meeting, I cannot really. I don't have any audio somehow. So, but this one, I hope you can hear. So I'm going to talk about the internal structure validity. These are the stats that we compute. Oh, so I should introduce myself, sorry. So I am Mayuko. I am working on Nebraska OAT assessment as a psychometrician. And we have coworker Lee. Lee has been a long time psychometrician, kind of slash stat analyst at DRC working on Nebraska. So he knows more about Nebraska assessment than me, but I present this one. And when there is a question that I don't know with some history, Lee may jump in. Yeah. So, into that. So these stats are some set of stats that we compute for tech report. And it all contributes to the validity of assessment. Validity is basically telling that the score we use is good. It's valid. So if any parts of the assessment is not good, it's not good. So any stats that we compute, any aspect in for the assessment can contribute to the validity. We do have a chapter for validity in the tech report, but the other chapters that we also contribute to the validity. In this section for the presentation, I have item difficulty, p-value, rush item difficulty, some descriptive statistics, discrimination, item twist correlations, item response theory dimensionality. We use some models to estimate ability and the parameters. We have to meet the assumptions. So we also check those assumptions. If they are not good, the validity is not good. So it's part of the validity evidence. So the other assumptions are local independence and item fit, test reliability, error of measurement, and decision consistency, accuracy, and strand correlations. These are the, I think, typical stats that psychometrician compute for any assessment. Item difficulty for this assessment is basically p-values. And we sometimes call item difficulty, and also item difficulty can be a rush measurement, rush ability. But p-value is a proportion of examinee in the sample who answered the item correctly. It's a 0 and 1 point item. So it's all dichotomous item. And relatively lower values correspond to more difficult items. That means like not many people are answering the item correctly. And have relatively higher values correspond to easier items. Items that are either very hard or very easy provide little information about student differences in achievement. We usually try not to select extreme items when we are building forms. Typically, test developer target p-values in the range of 0.4 to 0.8. In general, most of the item falls into the p-value range of 0.4 to 0.8, which is appropriate for a criterion reference assessment. So this is showing the table for ELA for all the grades 3 to 11. We have in the high school assessment. And the column is showing the p-value range, less than 0.1, less than 0.2, less than 0.2, meaning between 0.1 to 0.2. So you can see majority of the items are within 0.4 and 0.8 around that area. And occasionally we find some items with lower p-value or high p-values, but not, we try really not to have extreme. So this one we really don't have extreme p-values, and average p-value we target when we are building a form around 0.5, 0.55, something similar to previous years as well. And total item, operational item is 25. This is ELA, and math is similar. I just have table for all subjects and grades here, but they have similar patterns. Next one is rush item difficulty. A minimum and maximum value and standard deviation suggests that, looking at the numbers, this assessment covers a relatively wide range of difficulties. When we build forms, we look at the p-value ranges as well, and that also covers the rush item difficulty range. We try not to have like a focused area. We want to have some spread of p-values. So item difficulty reflect that. Some tests are narrower than others. So we try our best to when we are building forms, but sometimes we might end up with a little narrower range in some grades and subjects, but it just happened that way. And it is important to note that logic difficulty values presented haven't been linked to a common scale of measurement. So across grades, it's not vertically scaled. So you can't really compare across grade. Here is a summary stat for the ELA. The mean value is around 0, slightly positive, but around 0. And there is a standard deviation written here, and the minimum, maximum, and range. Minimum is a little lower than -1. Maximum is 1.0 to 1.6 area. So it ranges quite big. Ranges is in the most right column, showing the around almost 2 to 3 are the range. Same patterns for the math in terms of the range. It's pretty wide, 2 to 3. Some of them are a little wide. And this is for science. So we try to cover wide range of a p-value. Any assessment the same. When we are building it, we want to measure different level of students. So we do put wide variety of p-values and item difficulty in assessment. Item discrimination, this is Rush model. So when we talk about discrimination, this is item test total correlations. Items with negative correlations are flagged and referred to test development as possible miskeys. We do this process for operational item and also field test item. When we do the operational item, it's within the administration. We try to catch the wrong keys. And when we do the field test item, we try to catch bad items or possibly wrong key as well. So miskey items are corrected, should be corrected before the assessment, or if that happens during the assessment, which never happened, it should be corrected before the final stats or final scoring. Negative correlation can also indicate problem with item content, structure, or students' opportunity to learn. Item with 0.0 values of less than 0.2 are flagged and referred to content specialists for review before being considered for use in future form. So when we build a form, we try to have a good discriminating items. When the discrimination value correlation is low, high ability people are not scoring the item high. It seems like there's no relationship between the ability and item difficulty. In that case, we might see the correlation, low correlation. We don't want to have that situation, so we try to have a good discrimination values, like item correlations, as much as we can. With the special population of this one, sometimes it's difficult, but we tried our best. No items in 2022 tests have negative 0.5 correlations, and most are about 0.3, which is very good. and all values are positive and of acceptable magnitude. So usually we see no item is zero, less than zero correlations. This is the distribution of item correlations, and you can see most of them 0.3 to 0.6, and very small number of items are less than 0.1. Sometimes we don't have choice to choose other high correlation item when we don't have other item candidate in an item pool when we are building form for that specific standard. So we may have low correlation, but we try really not to have negative correlations. And we really focus on between 0.3 or larger than 0.2. Anything with 0.2, psychometric will say to content people that let's find out something else. And if we cannot find it, okay, we do our best. Among the items, we do pick the best item for that situation. So this is for ELA. And next one is math. Similarly, most are between 0.3 to 0.6, and so that's very good. And this is science. IoT unidimensionality. So we use a RAS model. You run the steps and get item difficulties and compute a row to scale score table. So because you use the model, we want to make sure that statistically we are fine with the assumptions. One of the assumptions is in unidimensionality. And RAS model assumes that one dominant dimension determines the difference among students' performance. The student take a test and we get the item responses, and the variability of the score should come from the student ability, mostly. So that's what we are trying to have. If we have other factors that contribute the most, that's going to be a problem. And we use a principal component analysis of residual from mean steps, and that can be used as a unidimensional assumption. Most of the measured components explain that these assessment for Nebraska's alternate assessment, ELA, math, and science, were essentially unidimensional, providing evidence supporting interpretations based on the total scores for the respective NASCA's alternate assessment. This is table showing some eigenvalues. So when we do factor analysis, we get eigenvalues. So we report these numbers in tech report. The point here is measure is ability, student ability, how much eigenvalue is coming from the student ability. And then rest of the factors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are in the residuals, and how many eigenvalues size is contributing to the total variability is shown here. So what we want to look for is measures. The raw measure is higher numbers here, and that's what we are seeing. And next table is showing the explained variance in percentage. So given the 100% is a variance in the item responses, we want to have a large proportion coming from the ability measurement, and which is happening here. You can see the first line of measures, grade 3 to grade 11. You can see above 20% are coming from the variability of item responses are coming from the student ability differences. And then when we get the residual, which is leftover variance, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you see smaller numbers than 20%. And in the residual, so grade 3 measurement ability is explaining 25% of the variability in the response. And then that's the biggest one. And in the leftover variability, 11% is contributed by one of the bigger factor in the residuals. But 11 is a lot smaller than 25. So we consider this as unidimensional. And all of the cases are the same. So measures having a good percentage, and then in the residual you see some percentage, but it's not as big as measures. Again, value for math and the percentage the same. Grade 6 is a little smaller, but around 20%. Same for science. So it's all showing the same patterns, and we consider that this test is unidimensional. And another assumptions, there are two more assumptions. Since the Rash model is a basis of calibration, scaling, linking analysis associated with the alternate assessment, the validity of inferences from these results depends on the degree to which assumptions of the model are met. So that's what I'm saying. Like if the model is not good, if the data is not good for the model, there's no like good reason to believe that the test scores are good. We want to make sure that assumptions are matched. The assumption of Rash models were essentially met for all alternate assessment data, indicating appropriateness of using the Rash model to analyze the alternate assessment. So one of the another assumption here we are looking at is local independence. What local independence is like items are independent. When you measure an item, meaning that give an item to a student, and we get the residual, some responses that students answers and expected values. When you compare observed minus expected, that's a residual, and each item we can get residuals, but those should not be related to each other. So no relationship should exist between examinees' responses to different items after accounting for the abilities measured by a test. So we are testing math and testing ELA is same content, but items should not be sort of like relying on each other or same item essentially. For example, right? We want to have independent items, so we want to maximize the information coming from that assessment. Residual item correlation provided in each step for each item pair were used to assess local independence among the items. But the majority of the correlations were very small, suggesting local item independence generally holds for this assessment. So when we look at the residuals, it's leftover things after taking care of the ability part, the items residuals are not so related to each other. And here, sample size is 300. It's a pair of items. So if you're given 25 items, you compare item 1 and item 2, residuals among 200 students, and you correlate with them, between them. And I can do that item 1 and 2, item 1 and 3, and then we repeat. And then in total, I have 300 pairs of items here. And then what we are looking for is a maximum. Maximum should be really small. And the bottom, second from the bottom row is telling maximum. So maximum correlation among one of the pair is 0.24, 0.32, 0.29, and these are pretty low correlations. So that's why we are calling that item seems to be pretty independent. We are not seeing 0.8 or 0.9 or 0.7, so which is really good. And the last row is showing that larger than 0.2, how many item pairs are larger than 0.2? It's only a handful. So I would say this is pretty good. This is ELA, and now this is math. Some grades has a little more independence. It could be related to content. It could be related to more special population situation for this old 1%. But this is a result, and it happened to have more item with a higher correlation, but with grade 4, but maximum is 0.33. So it's still pretty low. It's not that high. And this is for science and similar patterns. Item fit. When we build any statistical model, we have to check how the data is fitting into the model. And if the data doesn't fit into the model is useful. We're using Rash model. We check the item fit using the Rash model. The outfit statistics tend to be affected more by unexpected responses far from the person, item, or rating scale categories. Basically, infit, and there is two stats, infit and outfit, and it tells me that items are not fitting well in a data set. I read the second bullet, that infit statistics tend to affect more by unexpected responses close to the person, item, rating scale, category measure. So outfit is far away, infit is closer. we use some stats provided by WinStats output and expected infit outfit mean square error, which is a squared error, so it's positive, is a 1.0 and can range from 0 to positive infinity. Something around 1 is good. The values outside of 0.7 to 1.3 are given practical importance. It doesn't automatically mean that larger than 1.3 is a bad item, but it shows that it's showing relatively misfit of the item in the model. Most of the items had infit values falling into the range of 0.7 and 1.3. So here's a summary stats for the infit on the left side of the table and outfit on the right side of the table. And for ELA grades 3 to 11. And the mean is everything is about 1. What we expect, if everything is fitting, it's 1. So average is 1, which is really good. And the minimum, maximums is here. Minimum is, it seems mostly 0.7 or larger. So which is good. There's one item, looks like grade 11, ELA has minimum 0.64, but very close to 0.7. And large value, maximum value is larger than 1.3. We consider it large, but some people consider larger than 2 is really, really misfitting and should do something. But everything is less than 2 here. And when it's larger than 1.3, still close to 1.3. So we think this is pretty reasonable result. Here is math, similar patterns. And then each column, the last column for the each infit and outfit is showing how many items are within the range. So there are 30 items for math, grade 4 to 11. So among 30, how many are fitting into that? Most of them are 30 over 30. And if you see like 28 over 30, that means 2 items are outside the range. But then you look at the minimum, maximum, and when you see maximum is 1.34, it's a little bit larger than 1.3, so it's not that bad. So here, so these are all reported in the tech report every year.
Mayuko?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, before you move on to science, for ELA at grade 11, the outfit, the range suggested that only 19 out of 25, and then at grade 5, I guess 21 out of 25. In terms of the outfit statistics, the infit looked really good for everything. Is there anything at grade 5 or grade 11 in particular, I think, on ELA or then grade 3 in mathematics on the outfit that that you can speak to regarding why some of those may not have fallen within that range?
We haven't really dug into that kind of issues. We summarize the stats, and it's not that extreme. So it's less than 2.0, for example. So we haven't really looked at which item and what images of items and what could be the reason that why this item is not fitting well. We haven't really digged into that level yet, but yeah, that's something, if a state requests, definitely we can take a look at it. Yeah.
Okay.
It would be really helpful as you develop more items to understand what might be causing that.
Right.
So it'd be worth looking into.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for what it's worth, it is interesting to note that for the most part, I mean, again, everything is largely fitting within that range. At grade 3 and grade 11, at kind of the first and then that endpoint, if there are any sort of sample characteristics or distributional characteristics within the population that are influencing. And I know, you know, within ROSH or IRT in general, it's not supposed to be sample dependent, but when you're dealing with a full population of about 200 people, students per grade, that that may have some influence over the observed parameter estimates too, and the diagnostics then as a result.
Sure.
Okay.
We also look at the test reliability and SEM. So reliability estimate in SEM provide important evidence that assessment have strong internal consistency, expected measurement errors. What this is that when students take the test repeatedly, they will be in similar range of the scores. Say if your kid take a test and then every time the kid takes test is very different score, that is not reliable. We want to have a test that is more reliable, consistently see similar scores unless the students improve so dramatically in studying or something. Acceptable range value generally ranges mid to high 8.8 to low 0.9. So that's what we want to have. This assessment have reliability over 0.84, and it shows overall these reliability values provide evidence of good reliability. So this is a reliability and standard error measurement for ELA and math and science. And ELA grade 3 to 11, 0.86, 0.86 over mid 80, 0.8. So pretty good. Math is similar and science very good. So we call this assessment is pretty reliable. When the students take the assessment multiple times, they will likely have similar scores. Of course, it depends on the day. Sometimes the student perform differently, but that's within the error. Yeah. Decision consistency and accuracy. So we make a
Michael,
yes.
Can you
Yes.
just go back to the reliability slide there, just in terms of the standard error of measurement? Is that metric there? What is the scale?
I think it's a scale score. Correct
So
me
is
if
that,
I'm
is
wrong.
that is the metric in terms of the scale score?
I believe so.
So what is the range of the scale?
Was it? It's between. Okay.
It's like a raw score scale.
Lee, can you help me with this?
I believe this is the raw score.
Oh, raw score. Sorry.
It's a raw score. Okay.
Yeah.
Score. Sorry.
So somewhere between 25 and 30 questions, I think. Is that right?
Yeah, 25 to 30. Yeah.
Okay.
And they're dichotomous, so they're each worth a point.
Correct.
So yeah, okay.
Okay. Good point.
Thank you.
All right. Decision consistency. So we have the raw to scale scores conversion, but also give the performance level, 3 levels, right? Developing, on track, and advanced. The category should be consistent when students take multiple times. So decision consistency and accuracy result provide important evidence that examinees are being appropriately classified into performance level based on the test scores and the standards set on those scores. The overall decision consistency ranged from mid 0.8 to high 0.9, and while decision accuracy ranged from high 0.8 to the mid 0.9. If a parallel test were administered, the same test administered, at least 85% or more of students would be classified in the same level. With 2022 administration, the advanced cuts, which is the cut between on track and advanced, generally have the higher consistency values and exceeding 0.9 in most cases. And here are the numbers. We use these Livingston, Lewis, and Hanson and Brennan methodology, which is typically used in this as calculations. OT is on track, advanced, ADV. The cuts are shown. There are 2 cuts between because there are 3 levels. And what we are looking for is high values. And these are all about 0.8 is a 0.9. So we consider this that when students take the assessment multiple times, it doesn't have to be exact same form, but similar form. This assessment will classify students in STEM level consistently and accurately. That's what it is. And the math is here. And the science. Okay. The last section here is strand correlations. So in each assessment, we have some strands. We do not report the strand scores, but we do have a standard strands, and then we calculate the raw score points for that, and then correlate. And in this slide, I have disattenuated correlations only, because I thought maybe you don't want to look at all the tables staring at so many pages. But so in the tech report, we have observed correlations and disattenuated correlations. So disattenuated correlations are between strand scores within content areas presented here. Disattenuating the observed correlation, which is typically Pearson correlations, can provide an estimate of the relationship between strands if there were no measurement errors. So we use the reliability in the calculation of the disattenuating correlations. Intercorrelation between the strands within the content area are positive and generally range from moderate to high values. And these are the strands in the math, ELA, math, and science. So there's 3 in ELA, 4 in math, and science has 3. And for grade 3, there's no science, so there's 3 strands for ELA and the 4th strand in math. So generally it's high. What we typically look for is between the strands in same subject. So E1 and E2, E1 and E3, E2 and E3 tend to have higher correlations than E1 and math. But in this case, we have little different situation. And we haven't investigated why it's the case, but it could be due to the special population for this alternate assessment. But when you look at the math correlations, math M1 and M2, M1, M3, M1, M4. These attenuated correlations, it shows 1.0. Actually, in the calculation, I think you can go over above 1, but it's we provided ceiling of 1.0 here. So generally, it's high correlation among the strand.
And
I think,
Mayuko,
yes.
sorry, yeah, could you, just in terms of, I again noticed the E1 to E3 correlation as quite a bit different from the other ones. Could you, again, that might be something to explore, but could you also just explain for the audience why you would use a disattenuated correlation as opposed to kind of just a traditional?
So in tech report, yeah, okay. So in tech report, we provide both correlations, observed correlation and disattenuated. So in any measurement, you have measurement error in it. And based on this model and the data, we have reliability computed. So using that value of reliability, it's not 100% reliable, but we use that values to transform observed correlation to disattenuated, thinking that the goal is, what if we don't have measurement error? What are the relationship among those strands? So we try to see more than just observed. That's what the goal here. Typically, disattenuated correlations shows higher relationship than observed correlations. Yeah, so that's why it's not using the Pearson correlation, but using the Pearson's correlations and also reliability. It can exceed over 1, but in some project we do just like this. We do some ceiling of 1.0. This is grade 4 ELA and math, and within ELA and math. And you can see this is actually better than grade 3. Within ELA and within math, you have higher correlations than between the subjects. This seems better than the last one. But what we are really looking for is high correlation among strands as well. It's because it's same content, it feeds into the unidimensionality too, right? We were measuring ELA, we are measuring mass. It's not like we are measuring unrelated things. So we want to see high correlation among the strands within the content areas. So we are trying to provide all these kind of evidence. It's not like one evidence is sufficient for validity, but all aspect of the assessment the aspect that we looked at seems contributed the fact that this assessment is pretty good and valid. So I'm just having the different slides for different grades. This grade 8 doesn't have math M4 strand, so it's not written here. But typically, the numbers that we see here are what we expect. So higher correlations, and within the subject, you have higher correlation rather than across subjects.
So Maiko,
Mhm.
if we could pause here for a moment, I want to give.
Yeah, this
TAC
is actually the
member-
last one, so that's good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
good timing
so
then.
here are the questions, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanna ask our external TAC in particular, Jeff and Christy, in terms of those correlations that Mayuko was sharing with relationship to the strand level for English to English, English to math, English to science, math to science. Have you seen similar sorts of relationships within other alternate assessment programs? Because the correlations just seem very like very high, even though I know they're disattenuated. And so I'm just curious if there's anything that we want DRC to explore to ensure that what's being measured in those content areas is distinct from one another, so that it's not ELA skills being measured in mathematics. We know there's typically moderate correlations at a starting point, but these seem to be like really, really high.
It is a disattenuated correlation, so it's higher than the observed correlation. So.
Yeah, I haven't seen this kind of data for an alternative assessment before, so I don't have that point of comparison, Chad. So
okay,
it would be interesting to look into. You would think that you're measuring different things there, and they wouldn't be so highly correlated because at the end size of the population, I don't know. There could be a lot of things going on here that we don't see necessarily because of the population and the low numbers that are being assessed here.
Yeah, I'm surprised that they're that highly correlated just because of the diversity of the populations too, and the small sizes and the type of assessment that it is. So I'm surprised it's that high. But I also don't know enough about, is it all because kids are topping out or bottoming out? So I don't, it surprises me that they're that highly correlated. So it might make sense to look a little bit closer at some of the reasons why. If scores are all clustered in a certain spot or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is something that is worth exploring a little bit. And again, I know that some of that is probably related to the way that disattenuation works. You're trying to correct for suppression of the observed correlation given some of those population characteristics. But in a couple instances, there were higher correlations between an English strand and a science strand than between two of the English strands, which just seemed odd to me. So we obviously want to ensure that we're measuring something unique in each of these content areas, and that one particular skill is not just kind of like a dominant underlying skill, I think.
Yeah, we do, but we do have the dimensionality check and item residual correlation stats as well. But definitely we can maybe dig into possibly that population is so 1% population might be so special and different from general ed, and it ranges wide possibly. Some capable kids can do it in any assessment possibly than the people who cannot communicate well.
Yeah, so Maiko, you mentioned something interesting there in terms of the dimensionality checks.
Mhm.
When you're evaluating dimensionality, do you include the ELA, mathematics, and science all in the same dimensionality?
No, it's only for per grade and subject.
Yeah, and so I guess that's kind of my question is within a grade, within a subject, the dimensionality evidence that you showed suggested essentially unidimensionality for within a grade, within a subject. If you were to put all of this into a PCA, would you get three distinct dimensions, one for ELA, one for math, one for science, or is there a single underlying a single underlying dimension that basically explains all three of them?
Possibly we might find, like, hopefully ideally we find two dimensions, and each dimension have majority of the item load into that dimension, right? That's what we want to see, possibly, if we do that.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, let me open up to everybody the questions that you had for the TAC.
Can I ask a quick question first, Jan?
Sure.
I'm just curious, those who have done more in other states, is this pretty typical of just having one alternative assessments in states, or do some have, like we've talked about, based on those 1% students, is there different levels of testing depending upon where a student falls?
This is actually what I've seen, I think, in most states I've dealt with. I think there are some variations in terms of how, items are developed or kind of levels within items. But in terms of kind of, there's usually a single assessment for grade, for subject, for alternate students.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if there's what you're asking for, is there sort of an adaptive or staged adaptive approach to alternate assessments in some states? It's a really good question. You'd think it might be a good idea. I don't know if anyone's actually doing that, but you would think that it might be suited for this population.
Yeah, and we've talked about it here during this presentation, but just the variances between those students is just very unique and different depending upon the situation.
That's a great point, and I do think that some of that variability actually in an odd way contributes to a lot of the really high. So remember when Mayuku was showing the item total or the item discrimination correlations across grades, and most of them were above 0.3, and you had some in the 0.4, 0.5, even a few above 0.6. That's really unusual for dichotomously scored assessments in a lot of situations for larger populations. So in a way that almost illustrates the kind of range of ability within this population. Jeff, to your point, I'm aware at least of a few states that have tried adaptive for their alternate assessment. I know Indiana at one point. I don't know if they still do that. I should know that. But they at one point had an alternate or a adaptive assessment, staged adaptive assessment for their alternate. And does the DLM consortium, do they do adaptive, or is that just kind of based on the learning progression idea?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it enough, but it might be something to look into for Trudy to look into how states are handling this, if they all are giving one test for everyone, or is there a way to adapt this kind of program a little bit more? A good one program that is staged adaptive in many states is the test for English language proficiency, because of the wide range there's a similar a lot of variability in the population, from students who are just beginning to learn to speak and read and write English, versus those that are, fairly well along. And, you might say it's comparable to this population in that, in that the test may not be not quite suited for the full population. Some students may be able to engage with it much more than others. And that's where a staged adaptive approach can be really useful. Sometimes it's just a limit on just the resources the state can bring to this assessment itself, given the number of students. Because when you look at the cost of these programs for 200 students, the cost per test might be in the hundreds of dollars per student. If the state wants to invest more, it might be a good thing. They could do adaptive tests and have different forms and so on and so forth.
So the one thing to consider too with an adaptive test, this is Chandra from DRC and Program Management, is that this is a one-to-one administration, right? So a one test administrator is sitting down with one student. And as you saw earlier in the content evidence, the administration manuals are very descriptive of exactly what the procedure should be for the teacher. So doing like a multi-stage adaptive would definitely complicate like the administration of the assessment, just because you'd have to have scripts on hand for the teacher to be able to determine what the next script would be. So that's just something to consider with this type of one-to-one assessment.
But you could have sort of the first few questions could be sort of a locator. And depending on how students do on the, 4 or 5 questions, they would get Form A or Form B or Form C, and that's how a lot of the English language proficiency tests work that are staged adaptive. They have sort of a set of items at the beginning that help locate where the student should go next. So there's lots of ways to do that. I'm not trying to say Nebraska should do it, but it's something to consider as you move along and the program matures and you learn more about it.
The psychometric wise, I think the sample size is very small for this state. So remember, it's 200, 250. So it may be Indiana. I'm familiar with the Indiana assessment at one point, but it was like 3 different forms and 3 different levels. It was something like that. It may have had a larger sample size with the Indiana assessment.
Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, Indiana would have had a larger sample size, but the
field testing is the challenging part. If we do the adaptive, we need to have more items, and even when we make it stages, we do have chunks of item for stages, and to build that item bank could be a challenge.
I too think that maybe we could look at adaptive, because those alternate assessment kids though vary so greatly. And since we're in the process of writing the RFP, I think now would be the good time to do that if we are thinking about trying to go down that road. That's just my 2 cents, but.
Yeah, I think the point that Chandra made is important to consider, and that is for adaptive, the staged adaptive would be the potential, if NDE wants to consider an adaptive approach, staged adaptive gives them more opportunity to maintain that one-on-one administration, because you essentially, as Jeff was saying, have a locator form and then 2 or 3 additional forms that are essentially fixed and at that point. So it's not adapting item to item the way your general assessment is, because that would be I think a nightmare for production, but also a nightmare for your teachers to deal with. It would you'd be jumping around the script to try to determine what the next set of materials for the student is, whereas that staged adaptive is kind of fixed, and then you branch into one of the stages, and then it's fixed then within that stage. So, but it is a good point. And Josh, I don't know if that's what kind of where you were going with this in terms of differing levels.
Yeah, I was just asking, I understand the money and the administration is a big piece of that, but I just know what I hear from teachers a lot, especially obviously our special ed teachers, is just the variances of kids where I'll be honest with you, what I've heard from special ed teachers is they either pass pretty easily or they don't pass at all. But I understand the reasoning why though.
Yeah. Sharon, you put something in the chat around Michigan being the state that you're familiar with that has different levels. Are you familiar enough to like talk about that a little bit?
Kinda, Chad.
Okay.
So they have 3 different levels. The lower level, of course, are those really severe, significant students. And then they have a level where they're not independent learners, but yet they are learning some of those skills. And then their highest level are those kids that are borderline between independent levels with the most significant cognitive disability. And so, but their population, they test sometimes up to 10,000 kids. So it's easy for them to actually do that and make determinations of which area that they fall in. I can gladly reach out to their assessment director and get more information if you would like me to share with you.
Well, I mean, from the tax perspective, it's more of just a question or an observation. And I think perhaps if that's something that NDE wants to consider, it would be worth having that for, your internal discussion purposes as you're thinking about it. What is the, so trying to bring us back a little bit to Mayuko's question of, is there additional evidence that DRC should consider presenting for peer review? So the statistical evidence that was provided demonstrated pretty strong characteristics in terms of internal consistency, the standard error of measurement, the decision consistency and accuracy. That all looked pretty good. I think that question around the relationship or the correlations among the 3 subject areas is one that I would want to explore a little bit more, just to be confident that you really are measuring ELA distinctly from mathematics, distinctly from science. But I think in a way, some of the additional evidence that I was thinking about as we've, kind of been listening to DRC's presentation is perhaps even just some more qualitative data around how the assessment is created on the front end. So it kind of carries back to some of the content evidence that Betsy was talking about, and how the development of the extensions creates these access points for the diversity of students. Because, if what Josh is saying is kind of generalizable to the state, where students either do really well or really, not as well, is are there kind of sufficient access points for students at all levels of achievement to potentially, meaningfully participate in the assessment? And so that, I don't know, that was the one thing that I kind of kept coming back to, of like the purpose of this assessment is, we know the students may not be able to access the general assessment. So we're looking for bridges, we're looking for extensions to give them access opportunities to demonstrate that the instruction they're receiving is showing up in progress and outcomes. And so that would be I think the one piece of additional evidence I would, and it's probably there someplace, and maybe it's just like highlighting or talking about that more, and how that is helping students demonstrate what they're able to do.
I have a question for you. This is Sharon. To support what you just said, so we have been creating instructional supports for the teachers to support these extended indicators to go along with our assessment. Is that something that you would be referring to?
Uh, I think that's definitely one source. And I think then you'd want to then demonstrate how that is then connected, because with what peer review is looking at, they're really looking at it from the assessment and how does the alternate assessment connect to the general academic content standards. And so demonstrating how those extensions really connect and how they provide those sorts of opportunities. And then I think the supports are part of your inputs to say, and here's what we're, creating, offering, providing PD for the field in order to help ensure that these students have every opportunity to learn, and then every opportunity to demonstrate on the assessment. What else? What else from TAC in terms of evidence for peer review?
I know earlier on Jeff brought up the idea of doing cognitive labs. So I definitely have that on our list to talk with NDE about. So thank you for that suggestion, Jeff.
Sure. Great.
Anything else from DRC or TAC around the question? Okay. All right. Mayuko, thank you very much. Very well done.
Thank you.
Okay. Trudy, what's next?
That was what I had on the agenda. So I want to make sure that you all recall that we do have a TAC meeting scheduled for May 12th from 9 to 1. And the focal point of that is, as I mentioned, evidence of validity from ACT and also from Cambium for the ALPA 21. At some point, yes, Christy.
My calendar invite says May 11th.
That's what mine has too.
Oh, okay. Let me just
Thursday, May 11th.
It's Thursday.
Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. I think I looked at. Yeah, it's right there on my calendar too. So it's May 11th. Thank you, Christy, for calling that out. May 11th, May 11th, May 11th. Got it. Then we are going to be looking for a date in the summer. At some point, we want to bring, of course, accountability back to the TAC, because that is, of course, topics that we want your input on as well. So whether that's going to be able to be added in May or at some point early in the summer, we want to make sure that we have those conversations around our accountability system, because there are some questions, some things that Vicky Munoz, who is now our director, leading up that the accountability department, questions around chronic absenteeism and discipline, I think. So Vicky, do you want to just touch real briefly on a couple items that you'd like to have them talk about? So think about maybe.
Sure. I think I'll just talk about our most immediate item for now. And I know Trudy will follow up with an update and agenda, but for May, our item will likely be our ALPA 21 cut scores as used for accountability measures. So that is probably the topic that is first on the agenda. But again, we'll fill you in with more details as we have additional information.
Thank you.
Good.
And at some point, I will want to, I'm sorry, Chad.
Go ahead.
one of the unanswered questions that was brought forward in January was test design. So again, we will want to have the tax input on this concept of through year and what that would look like. So do want to have that conversation as well.
Great. Yeah, so Trudy, I would say for our May agenda, we might want to just tentatively think about getting a presentation from ELPA, from ACT, kind of for their components of the assessment system, limiting those to maybe an hour each, 45 minutes to an hour, and then having a couple hours specifically for accountability, just because we'll have all kind of the assessment component pieces, and then that way we can start thinking then about how this all blends into the accountability system. Especially, I don't know if you have any sort of reporting requirements coming up, but we don't, anything that you need to prioritize, and Vicki, thanks for mentioning the ELPA cut scores, anything that you want to prioritize that to bring to this group in May, we'll get that added to the agenda.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's all that I needed to speak with you folks about.
Great. Well, perhaps maybe first time ever we're like ahead of schedule on attack. So
I know.
I'm gonna give Trudy all the credit for the agenda to making sure that we were efficient. So well, listen, I'm not going to belabor it then. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to DRC. Excellent presentation and wonderful information for our alternate assessment system in Nebraska. And thanks to NWEA, I don't know if folks are still on from there, for the information about the standard setting this summer. And we'll look forward then to our next discussion in May. And Trudy, any advanced materials that you get from ELPA or ACT related to kind of the validity pieces for their programs, feel free to send those along. And Vicki, start thinking up questions for us.
Will do.
Sounds
Thank
great.
you so much. Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate everybody.
Yes,
TAC
thanks to
members,
State Board and
thank you.
everybody to attend to.
Yeah, and everybody else on the call, thanks for giving us your time.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.